Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Today's video is going to be concerning the problem with missionary Tanakh interpretation, chapters in Midrashim. So to start off with, as I mentioned in a previous video, there are a couple of videos that I've done that if you look through my video list as well as the playlist, that concern certain issues that are directly or kind of like support some of the things I'm mentioning here. So I suggest that you look at some of those videos because I do a lot of things that cover things back and forth, and they kind of sometimes are connected or some semi-connected to each other. So I want to address two primary areas where missionaries manipulate people, and I forget to put S on the areas. Um, the first one is the use of chapters and verses in the Tanakh, and the second one is Midrashim, essentially where they try to like prove something, but the Midrashim themselves don't prove the missionary claims about the New Testament or Jesus, but the use of them by missionaries is in an attempt to try to claim that they do. So, as with my practice in the last few videos, I think it's important to deal with the issue of what is considered to be Torah and Torah Shabbat Peh. And this is going to become important in just a second when we explain something about Midrashim and the nature of them. So first of all, if you haven't seen my other videos, in order to understand what the word Torah means, what the concept of Torah means, it comes from a three-letter root, which is this one right here in the red. You see Yud, Resh, He. Okay, that means to like that's usually the three-letter root concerning something to cast or to shoot, something like shooting an arrow. And then if you deal with it in terms of like the verbal form hifil, the word hora is used to mean instruct or teach, and then the word Torah itself, being from this hifil form of the word in the Hebrew grammar, means to Torah means instruction, direction, precept, law, mode, or manner. So these are the meanings of the word Torah. So when someone says that there's a written Torah, they're meaning that it's a written instruction or direction or precept, law, mode, or manner. But if someone says it's an oral Torah, what they're saying is there's an oral instruction, direction, precept, law, mode, or manner. The word Torah itself does not specifically mean written text. If you look throughout the Tanakh, you'll find situations where it's very specific. That's what's being talked about as the written text, because it'll say bichtuv, or katav Moshe, something like that. But there are other areas where it's just simply the word Torah is used to mean instruction with no connection to a written text. So one of the things, starting at the first thing I mentioned about the chapters and verses, let's look at an actual text from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this right here is a Dead Sea Scroll. Now, I guarantee you, if you were to take this particular picture to most missionaries that are out there, most of them would not know how to read this at all. And why is it exactly? You could say, well, look, this is the Torah. This is like, from the book of Deuteronomy. It's a Dead Sea Scroll. Many of them are over 2,000 years old. Some of them are 2,500, 2,200. How is it that you don't know how to read this? Well, one of the issues is because of the fact that, first of all, the script itself is a little bit different than what most people are used to in modern Hebrew. It's a Hebrew script. It's the exact same script, but the scribe himself wrote it in a way to where someone may not recognize that this is Mem Sofit, for example. Someone may not, recognize, for example, that they may think this is Het. In modern Hebrew, this looks more like Het. But in the Hebrew of the time, the scribe himself, the way the person wrote it, is a Hey. So first of all, it will require something, of an oral Torah to even understand what the letters are in this particular scribe's manner of writing. But here's the other thing. Look, do you see any chapters or verses here? None whatsoever. There are no markings here that tell you where a verse starts, where it ends, or even where the chapters are. So this is the other thing that in ancient Hebrew, there were no, like, for example, chapters. Now, there was an oral understanding of divisions of where a sentence ends and starts. That did exist, because otherwise you could say that a sentence starts here and goes to here, or maybe it starts here and goes to here. There obviously was an oral understanding of how that worked. Now, the second thing I want to look at is like when you look at what's called the Great Isaiah Scroll. It's like one of I think probably the oldest complete text of Isaiah of Yeshayahu. That was actually his name, not Isaiah. Um, and if you look here, same thing. There's no chapters or verses marked at all. So essentially, a person would have to know exactly where, something is considered to have started and where it's considered to have ended. For example, modernly, someone could say, well, okay, well, you have Isaiah 49:16. Well, you don't see any of that here. There's no divisions there. So, for example, I know that this is the beginning of a concept or thought because of the spacing here. That's an oral tradition, for example. But I also know that if one were to want to analyze, let's say chapter 16, that starts right about here and ends here. So there's a missionary at one point who was trying to make a point that, this particular like verse right here, points to like, there being a Trinity. But there's nothing here that mentions anything about a Trinity here. And also, there's nothing here that indicates where it starts and ends in terms of what's being talked about. For example, this word here, "warujo." Warujo could be the end of something here, or it could be the beginning moving over to here. Depends on what, the tradition is about it. So a person always has to have oral tradition. But again, there's no verses and chapters. And that's what breaks about this idea that some people have where they say, well, chapter 49. But there's no chapter 49 here at all. In ancient times, there was no chapters. There would have been understanding of where certain ideas start because of the spacing. But there is no like chapter demarcations, for example, and there are no verse demarcations. And if you look at this and read it in Hebrew, it actually mentions nothing about a Trinity, and it makes it clear, for example, that at one point the Creator of all things is talking, so right about I believe here, and then, for example, it switches to the prophet talking, about here or so, and that's just based upon the language itself and based upon an oral understanding. Now, in modern times, a modern Torah scroll, which is read in a synagogue, officially, it also is written without or transcribed without any kind of chapters or verse marking. So you see that there's no markings of chapters or verses here at all. So a person reading this would have to already have an oral understanding of how this works. So for example, in Jewish communities, every week, for example, there's at least 3 to 4 readings of the Torah that happen during that week. So essentially, when this is read from in the synagogues, I'm a part of the Yemenite synagogue. For example, every person who's called to the Torah reads for themselves. So they would have to have, we're already orally taught when we're younger how to read this and understand exactly where, the pauses are, where, a particular sentence starts and stops, exactly when to like move on to the next area, for example. So in ancient times, there were no chapter markings, there were no verse markings. So the question someone going to ask is, well, where did the chapters and verse markings come from? Okay. In terms of the chapters, we know that that's an actual Christian innovation that came about, I think, based on the information here in the 1500s or so. Right. And essentially, what what we have here is that this is something that didn't come from the Jewish community of marking chapters, for example. So this is something you can look up the particular article here, but it addresses how if you look in like Christian translations, their use of chapters and verses is based upon their own creation in the 1500s. It's not something that came from the ancient Jews, who started Christianity. It came from later like Christians, for example. By like token, when it comes to us Jews, I found this, from the Chabad website in English, and this is something to explain that essentially, our concept is that the creator of all things gave to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, the actual understanding of where, a sentence starts and stops, which is called a pasuk, where the grammar is, for example, and that was transmitted orally. And then it was only about 1,500 years ago that that oral transmission was transferred into creating vowel points and also grammar markings by the Masoretes, the Mosortim. You may have heard of them, and I've talked about them in other videos. But also this particular, page from Chabad also explains what I was saying earlier, that the divisions into chapters, that was something that was done by people who weren't Jewish. It wasn't a Jewish concept that came about. So this is one of the things when I notice missionaries are using chapters and verses, you always have to be aware of the fact that they're using a concept that didn't come from the Jewish community, that came from them. At least when it comes to the chapters, in terms of the verses, sometimes their verses don't even show that the proper grammar, which is integral to really understanding what the text says. So now we've gotten through that part of it. Let's deal with the second question I brought up. Are there midrashim that prove, agree with, or support missionary claims? Now, the answer to this may actually shock you, coming from me and others, people like me. The answer to that is yes and no at the same time. They're, being completely honest, it is possible, to find things that support missionary claims, not really the New Testament itself and not the whole idea of Jesus and Jesus being a Messiah figure and all that kind of stuff. Not that as much, but the ideas that they kind of pull out of those texts. You could find things that support it and disagree with it in terms of Midrashim. And there's, the more detailed answer about this is a person could find a Midrash for essentially anything. There are Midrashim that sound similar to New Testament ideas, and there are Midrashim that completely debunk them. So this part here requires a little bit of investigation to understand what I mean by that. And I'm going to have to like close out this section and actually show you what I mean in just a second. So let me close this down here. And if we look, for example, and first question I've noticed that whenever these issues come up with missionaries, it's not often that I see people like kind of show, or ask the question, or deal with the issue. what exactly is a midrash? Because often you'll see that, missionary will pull out a midrash out of nowhere and simply say, well, this midrash supports this idea here in the New Testament, or this midrash says this, why is it that you guys don't accept it? And the first thing that a person should be asking is, okay, well, first of all, let's even deal with what a midrash is, before we even deal with that. So in short, the best place I would say to go to that is you will have to look through Jewish sources because the Midrash is a Jewish text. So essentially, if you go to the Encyclopedia of Yahudut, or Yehudit, sorry, essentially what it explains is the following: Midrashim, Sfarim hamilchilim inyane dorush behalacha uforat ba'agada beorech ze namenim sifrei midrashim ha'ikariyim. So essentially what it explains is that, midrash is like a type of text or a type of writing that deals with the, certain topics or issues that either are, dealing with topics of halacha, of Jewish law from the Torah, Torah-based law, or it's dealing with what's Agadah. So Agadah could be sometimes like legends. Agadah could be just different concepts. Agadah could be something that's not, binding, for example. So we'll see in just a second how, for example, when it comes to halacha, if something is proven halacha that came from, either the Torah directly, or it came from a Mosaic court, or it came from the Sanhedrin, the Bet Din HaGadol, or the Supreme Court of Torah that used to exist in the land of Israel, that's fixed. We don't change those things. But if there's something that's like an Agadah, I don't have to accept every Agadah just because it's there. So, because of the fact of the nature of what an Agadah is to begin with. So this site, gives us like several examples of different type of midrashim. But then also here's the point what I was making earlier. Okay, because there's some midrashim, like I said before, that are dealing with halakhic topics, and there are some that are dealing with specific agadah, legends, different discussions, or even investigations into the Torah. So I could write my own midrash, and it could be my own personal investigation in the Torah, but it doesn't mean that everything I'm saying is like historically factual. It doesn't mean everything I'm saying is an idea that someone should accept. It could be just the sermon of the day, that this is my particular thoughts on the Torah. So let's say that a missionary comes to you and says, well, this midrash says this about the New Testament. Well, the first issue you have is, well, there's lots of midrashim. Here, if you look at this, is midrashim shonim. So this is not a full list, but this is like a list of a number of midrashim that exist in the Jewish world. So everything that's in bold is the name of the midrash, and everything that's like light is a description of what it is or where it came from or what time period it comes from or even what it discusses. So this whole list here is only a partial list of the different midrashim that exist. So what happens sometimes is that you'll find, that certain messianics or missionaries will pull one midrash, pull one part of it out, usually out of context, and say, "Aha, this supports my idea." But if you look further in that same midrash, you can find things that completely discredit their idea. You can also find other midrashim that also discredit their idea. So it's like, well, how did you decide to pick that midrash over another one? Why that one rather than this one? So there's lots of midrashim that exist out there, and this is just like even a partial list of all the ones that they put together in their particular list. So further, there's like the issue of, okay, what's Agadah exactly? So there's different types of Agadah that exist, but as I mentioned before, I described that is. So what I want to do now is if I go to Kippah.com, which is like a religious, Torah-based Jewish site and one of the things they have is like question answers. So someone can ask a question. So someone asked the rabbi here, Mahu midrash. What is a midrash? So the rabbi explains here. בהבנת המדרש עסקו ברבים מגדולי חכמי ישראל לאורך הדורות, וספרים רבים חברו בנושא. אוכל רק לשרטט לך כמה ראשי הפרקים בנושא ולתת לך הפניות. אם יש לך שאלות נוספות לגבי הדברים שהאלה במשך או בעניינים אחרים, אמרו להתייחס. So he's basically just kind of giving a kind of an introduction to explain to this person that, essentially Midrash is like the different works of different like, great leaders within the Jewish community over, the many generations. So he says, okay, further, המילה מידרש מציינת צורת לימוד שהייתה נוהגת. So essentially what this means is that by definition, a midrash might be the investigation of a particular rabbi, a particular Jewish leader, or just a particular Jew who's kind of just doing their own thought process about, what's in the Torah, what's in the Nevi'im, the prophets and things like that, what's in the Hebrew Tanakh itself. But one of the important elements that has to be remembered, and this is something that's actually explained by the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, as well as the Ramban, Moshe Rabbi ben Nachman, that there's no requirement that if there's some midrash out there that says something, I have no requirement, or no Jew has a requirement to accept it just because it's there. What this means is that, as an example, when Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban, was forced into a dispute, a disputation, basically an argument concerning the New Testament and concerning Jesus with a minister, well, not a minister, but a priest by the name of Pablo Cristiani, who was formerly Jewish. Essentially, one of the things that public Christianity was doing during this public debate, which was in front of the king in that region at the time, he was like saying, "Well, you guys have the Talmud that says this," and he was pulling out things that are either midrash or what's called agadah from the Talmud, which are all kind of like different the things we've just been describing about midrashim. And he was saying, "Well, this midrash says this," and to try to support this idea of something that was in the New Testament. But the Ramban explained to him, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman explained to him that I'm under no requirement to accept that agadah. I personally don't accept it, and even if I were to accept it, what you've described doesn't fit what you're describing either, because you didn't read further that it says this and you didn't understand that it means this, for example. So that's one of the important elements here, that just because there's a midrash doesn't mean that anybody has a requirement to accept it. The Rambam even explains this very well. That if, for example, there's a midrash that tells me that something happened in reality, and I know in reality it didn't happen, I don't have to accept it just because like a rabbi wrote it. I don't have to accept it if it has like a historical claim that, is proven to be false or inaccurate. It could have just been for his time. He had a certain understanding that was wrong. A rabbi can be wrong. Doesn't, just because somebody's a rabbi doesn't mean they're right. Um, and it could be that they had a lack of understanding of that time. If a rabbi wrote something about science, during a time where they didn't have the scientific tools to figure something out, I don't have to in the modern day accept what they wrote. So someone saying, well, this midrash says this and it supports something that that the Torah tells me it doesn't support, and that the Torah tells me is not true. I don't have to like forget the Torah and go to find a midrash to support it. I can say, I don't accept that midrash. I don't accept that agadah. And one of the things that's also important concerning this issue is that when you look at missionaries, they often will pull out midrashim that they themselves don't even agree with. So for example, if you have a missionary who says that there's no oral Torah, but the midrash is based on an investigation of oral Torah, well, how can you use that midrash if you say there is no oral Torah? As soon as you say there's no oral Torah, the midrash is completely invalid. It doesn't support anything. Yeah, I understand that you want to try to say, well, I should believe you because of that. But again, this is what goes back to what I've mentioned in previous videos. If something historically didn't happen, there's no obligation I have to look at it and say, well, this midrash says this, it must be true. No, I go by the Tanakh. The Tanakh is the source, the start and the finish of all things. And Midrashim are just simply, like I say, that the Ramban explained, the sermons of the day. This is like, in that generation, somebody was discussing something. In this generation, we look at Midrashim to just understand how people thought. It doesn't mean that they were right. It doesn't mean that they were wrong. It just means that we're looking to understand it. And, there are some Jewish communities where they accept Midrash as like fact no matter what. But then those same communities only accept certain Midrashim. They don't accept every Midrash under the sun. And as I showed before, that there's a whole list of them you could choose from, and you can find ideas that contradict or support almost anything. I had a friend of mine who's a rabbi. We were talking about this once, and he was saying, like, you could prove or disprove anything with a midrash. All you do is just look enough and you'll find something that someone wrote at some point, but it doesn't mean that we accept that. So this is a Havever from the Chronicles of a Havever. I hope this helps. Take care and bye.